Hello, everyone. We're live now. Welcome to the first live stream ever today, in a very tough day, to say the least. I'm going to start off with the recent developments. Literally, in the last hour, there have been news from Israel, basically in Jerusalem, that there has been an attack on a synagogue, and over 7 Israelis were killed. Now, this comes after one day that 9 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces in Jenin, which was going to be the primary subject of my live stream today. But obviously, seeing as this happened now, we'll also add it to our discussion. Basically, we need to go back a bit in time to discuss how everything evolved to the current situation, basically following the forming of the new Israeli government. You have had multiple actions being taken that were highly resisted within Israeli society. Now, I've spoken about this previously a little bit, but I'll reiterate a couple of things. Number one, the current Israeli government is formed out of the most right-wing figures in Israeli history. So you obviously have Bibi Netanyahu, you have Bezalel Smotrich, you have Ben Gvir, who is a convicted terrorist. And the main kerfuffle in Israel about what's happening in terms of what the government is doing is basically what the government is calling a judicial reform, that the other party is calling a judicial coup, which is basically going to allow the government to appoint any type of Supreme Court judge, any judges in any court in Israel that as it wishes. So basically, the legal system, the courts will be under Israeli government, and they will only have people who are completely in line with the Israeli government. Now, there's been a massive outrage within Israeli society, including from main figures, top figures who were in the army previously, and current figures in the army and in other institutions in Israel. Now, in my previous video, I spoke about obviously the demands and kind of the what's right and what's wrong about them, and how no real protests and calls for democracy will be fully just unless you basically include everyone in them, primarily the Palestinian people who have been suffering for so long. However, one thing that's very important in what's happening at the moment now, before I get to that, the government is basically going through these judicial reforms because top leaders in the current government, and led by Netanyahu, are facing legal challenges. So Netanyahu, he has cases against him for corruption, for previous deals that he's done while he was prime minister previously, in one of his previous terms, that he had done illegally, supposedly. You have a convicted felon in the government, Aryeh Deri, the leader of Shas, who was in prison for fraud. And basically, there's currently a challenge from the courts for him to take his position, basically, that's banning him from taking his position. Netanyahu obviously doesn't want to face any consequences for any mishaps and wrongdoings he's done previously, and they want complete authority over the judicial system. So that's why they're basically going for what they call the judicial reform. However, the level of protests and the level of anti-campaign within Israeli society has been very much big and increasing with time against all of these actions. So, as usual, what does Israel do when they basically face a lot of challenges internally? They export the problem to the Palestinians. So whenever there's an internal problem, they'll either go out for a war, which is what I thought might have happened previously, but they eventually formed a government, so there was no need for that. However, with the current level of internal chaos, basically, and turmoil, they basically need to find someone to export the problem to, and it's generally the Palestinian people. Why? Because they're the ultimate enemy. They are the people who you need to export your problems to, and they are the ones who are closest and easiest enemy, so to speak, to show that to show to the Israeli society that we're constantly under threat, and we basically need to focus on the real enemy here rather than fight internally. Also, not only is the current situation in Israel torn between kind of the government and the anti-government camp, you also have problems internally. So for Netanyahu to form this current government, he had to come up with several positions that did not exist before. So you already have way too many ministers in Israel in comparison to the number of MKs and population, basically. But he had to create some more positions to please his right-wing neo-Nazi allies, basically. So one of these positions was a minister in the Ministry of Defense. So you have a Minister of Defense who's basically in charge of the army, and the chain of command leads to them. And you have now a minister in the Ministry of Defense. And who is the minister in the Ministry of Defense? Bezalel Smotrich. This guy is a radical religious nationalist extremist, okay? And he called and still calls for the expulsion of Palestinian people. And he is a minister in this ministry, basically. So the first conflict that they had internally was just a few days ago. Every once in a while, radical Israeli settlers in the West Bank create an outpost. So they go to a Palestinian land, put a couple of random buildings, and they say this is an outpost and this is Israeli land. So they created one a few weeks back. And under the current coalition agreement, the authority to remove people from this outpost or keep them in lies with Smotrich, who is the minister within the Ministry of Defense in Israel. But the Minister of Defense, who is Gallant, ordered the evacuation of this outpost. Now, they had a meeting following that, and Netanyahu actually sided with Smotrich against Gallant, who had the backing of all of the chain of command below him in the IDF. So you have massive tensions within the government as well. And typically, as with any other situations, the easiest thing to do is blame it on the Palestinians, export the problem, which is what we're seeing at the moment. Now, what happened in Jenin isn't something new. You have people getting killed every day. But what happened recently is a deliberate escalation so that it can take a different level, and in the hope, in the eyes of the current Israeli government, to de-escalate what's happening internally and focus on the Palestinians rather than the Israeli society. And obviously the Palestinians, as usual, pay with their own blood, unfortunately. So that's what's happening. Today also, you've had this news just around an hour ago that there was an attack on a synagogue one day after the Israeli attack that killed 9 people in Jenin. And it seems like we're heading towards an escalation. I obviously hope that it doesn't go too far, but it seems like we're heading towards an all-out escalation unless something very drastic happens. But traditionally, and from what I've seen previously, historically, Israel always takes it out on the Palestinian side, and usually it ends with a brutal all-out war. How it would end this time with the current dynamics, will the current protests within Israel make an effect or have an effect on what's happening, or the war and how it would end? Who knows? But that's the situation as it is for the moment. And I think I'll end it at that for the first live stream. Hopefully, we'll have more regular live streams, perhaps on a weekly basis, or maybe every few weeks. And if you guys have any specific subjects apart from the one that I spoke about today, feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts as well. And I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Take care.